Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
And we're here for Revenge in part 2 of Cape Fear.
Yeah, we're back with a vengeance.
It's been 14 hours, minutes, seconds since we last talked. And
Nanoseconds.
I'm ready to get my revenge on you and your entire family, Michael.
Okay, well, wow, that's aggressive. I guess when me and my mom come to your wedding, that's the time.
Yep.
You want to knock us all out with one fell swoop.
I'm playing the long con.
I guess so. I respect that.
So this is part 2 of our discussion of 1991's Cape Fear, a remake from one of the greatest directors of all time, Martin Scorsese, starring one of the greatest actors of all time, Robert De Niro. And
Hey, here's a question that I forgot to ask you in our last episode.
Yep.
Have you seen the original?
I have not, and I think that we should do it on this podcast at some point.
I think we should too. It would almost, if we weren't doing Director's Month, it would almost be beneficial to do it right after this.
Yeah, I think this is one we maybe revisit next year, in maybe our crime or our horror slot. But and this is because, and maybe, you know what, maybe this is a good point to talk, because we're into the deep dive, the spoiler discussion.
Yeah, spoilers. Go watch the movie.
Maybe this is a good time to compare and contrast the source material. The original novel came out in 1957. It's called The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. And then that was adapted in 1962 into Cape Fear, which then was remade by Scorsese in 91.
Also called Cape Fear. And what's really cool is actually, I when I was doing my research on this, if you go to the Executioner's Wikipedia page, there's a really good chart of all three different works and a chart of the differences between each of the film as well as the 1962 film and the Executioners. I am pulling that up right now.
Yeah, it's really cool. I would highly recommend you go check it out. What's really interesting is each film kind of becomes, in a way, a product of its time. Whereas in The Executioners, Katie was a rapist who raped somebody during World War II. And Bowden was actually a witness to that rape at that time. There was a larger family there. There wasn't Sam wasn't cheating on his wife. There's some differences in how the film's trajectory goes. There's a lot of differences even to the level of violence and tension in the book, and then the subsequent film and Scorsese's film. Like, Scorsese's film is much more aggressive and violent and rapey than the other two original novel and film.
Yeah, and actually, I'm scrolling through the Wikipedia page right now, and you're right.
Yeah, it's really cool. Hey, like it's a really cool comparison. I'd never seen a nice, succinct differences laid out in this way.
Wow. They should do this for all adaptations. Just a nice chart, just to be like, here's what we kept, here's what we changed, etc., etc.
And you know what? The one thing that I do want to note in this list here is actually basically how Max Cady and Sam Bowden are connected, because in the 1991 Cape Fear, the one that we're talking about now, Bowden was a defense attorney at the time, and he basically buries a report that potentially could have exonerated Katie, that the rape victim was sexually promiscuous.
Ooh.
Which is funny, because so in the Cape Fear from 1962, he was actually witnessed the rape and then testifies against Katie, and it's kind of similar-ish to the Executioners as well. And what I find really interesting about these is that the 1991, the reason why Katie and Bowden kind of have this contention with each other, I find that sexual promiscuity, like, that's really dated almost at this point in time. Like, it's really strange. And maybe this is also me coming in from a modern audience perspective, right? Like, again, it's like, well, Sam was maybe like, if the law cared about that, then Sam is probably justified in not, like, making that a part of their case. Like, this Max Cady guy is a monster.
I think I read somewhere that actually in the 70s they passed legislation that said you're not allowed to bring up the you're not allowed to bring up the victim's sexual history in a case like this.
Right.
So maybe in the 1960s movie that would have made more sense, but in the 90s version it's a little dated, I guess.
Well, and I mean, it's so this is 14 years prior, right? So this does the original crime does take place in the 70s. So
that's a good point, actually.
Yeah, so maybe at that point in time it does kind of make sense, but it just, as a modern audience watching it, it did jump out as me as feeling like somewhat dated, unrealistic, and dated at this point in time.
Well, I don't know that I'd agree that it's unrealistic, but I think it does kind of tie into a larger theme in the movie of just how incompetent the legal system can be.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, it just shows, like, you know, it just shows how completely ineffectual and how easy it is for a guy like Max Cady to exploit.
Oh, easily. And that actually kind of segues into maybe a good discussion that I wanted to talk about. And that's the really horrifying rape and assault of Lori, Sam's potential extramarital affair, potentially cheating on his spouse with. It starts off in the film and he's like, I don't want to cheat, but you and I are having a lot of fun together, kind of thing.
So the deal is that she's a clerk at his office, and like they're hanging out, and it's clearly extremely flirty.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like it's gotten physical yet. But we also kind of find out that he has had extramarital affairs in the past when they lived in like Atlanta or something.
Right.
So it's clearly it's clearly not cool, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But...
And this is actually the reason why I wanted to bring this up, and in relation to the legal system. When Sam goes and visits her in the hospital and he realizes that she was the one who was assaulted by Cady, and Cady specifically has picked her out to torture Sam, and to put Sam on trial. She refuses to testify because she's so afraid of Max Cady and afraid of the ineptitude of the legal system. She's afraid of having to stand in front of her peers and explain
the public humiliation.
Yeah, the public humiliation of it. And like that felt really sincere and very sad. Like it
uncomfortably sincere. Yeah.
Yeah, like it felt so earnest to current society. Like I think that this, maybe coming in at it from a male perspective, I think that it might present something that you might not have thought as hard about as a male.
Yeah, which, she has this line where she's like, I don't want to have to explain what I was drinking. I don't want to have to explain where I was. I don't want to have to explain what I was wearing. Like, I don't want to have to like deal with those guys. Like, I don't want to have to confront those guys who cross-examine the witnesses and then go and laugh about it after. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's heartbreaking. It's almost the most gut-wrenching scene in the whole movie.
I agree. Like that one I really struggled with, and I really reflected on that for a long time, because it was a perspective that it's something that obviously you're made aware of, and you're made aware of like some of the injustices in the world. But I think this is maybe one of the best and most earnest portrayals of that type of injustice that I've ever seen portrayed in film before.
You know what it was? It was sobering.
Yes.
Like, you're just like, ugh, like, I need a drink.
Oh, easily. Maybe we'll move into how comically inept the law felt throughout this film. Like there's so many times where the law is basically just like, we can't help you. He isn't really doing anything. You know, like there's nothing legal happening, even though it's like, I would hope that the police would be like, you know what? He has a connection to you. He's done some pretty horrible things in the past. Let's go like knock on a few doors. Kind of
this
thing.
Is probably probable cause, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's early in the movie, Max Cady poisons the family dog.
Right.
And they bring Cady and Sam Bowden down to the station, and Sam Bowden is privately talking to the detective. And the detective's like, so he stole the dog? And he's like, well, no, he didn't steal the dog. It's like, so he was in the house. He broke into the house. He's like, well, no, I don't he didn't really break into the house. And he's like, I don't really know exactly how he did it, but I know he did it. And the police detective is immediately like, hey man, you're a lawyer. You know there's nothing I can do here.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, drop it, let him go, like all this stuff.
Right, and that leads to a really interesting point in the film as well, when the police chief says without saying, essentially, like, you might have to take the law into your own hands here.
There's that, yeah, it's that great scene where, what does he say specifically? It's like, well, you know, like if it were me, like maybe... He says, he almost kind of like encourages him to get a gun. He's like,
right.
What are you saying? He's like, you saying I should blow his head off? And then the detective's like, hey, like, I'm an officer of the law. It would be really irresponsible of me to recommend someone take the law to their own hands. I'm sorry if you misunderstood me. And then he walks away.
Right.
Like, yeah.
That's a highlight, like, discussion for me as well in the film.
So good. And then I want to talk about the private investigator, because he was one of my favorite characters, but he was also like extremely ineffectual the whole time.
Yeah.
Like, you know, also he drinks Pepto-Bismol and scotch, which I guess like,
well, okay. So I was rewatching the scene earlier where he's murdered, and he actually, because I've already seen the scene now and I actually get to pay attention because I'm not like just sitting there in an absolute panic at what's happening. I actually was listening to what he was saying instead of trying to figure out what was about to happen. And he mixes his Pepto-Bismol and scotch, and he says, actually, this is like what I was taught on the force is like my late night stalking, or whatever it's called, drink.
I think what he says is, my dad used to drink this when he was on stakeout.
Yeah, stakeout, yes.
The movie kind of implies that this guy either wasn't good enough to stay on the force, or he wasn't good enough to get on the force in the first place.
Yes, and that's really, really great about the film, is that Max Cady makes it personal for him too. Max Cady is just so good at getting under the skin of each and every person in this movie. It's fantastic. The only person that he doesn't get under the skin of until the very end is Danielle. And this is where, we get that really, really grimy scene with Danielle and Max down in the auditorium alone in the basement of the school, and you don't know what's going to happen.
That whole thing was so grody.
Yeah. And what's really cool about that scene is that it was all filmed in one take with two different cameras being shot.
Really?
And that was their first take at doing that together as well. And it's because Robert De Niro is such a charming person that for this brief moment in the film, he turns back the like psychotic tendencies of him, even though that's what he is, but he's just so damn charming. He's just so like damn charismatic that like, you're kind of like getting taken for a ride with him.
I don't know. The whole staging of it too. So like the deal is Danielle goes into this empty auditorium. It's like an empty theater, and there's the set on stage is the gingerbread house from Hansel and Gretel.
Right.
And then he walks out of it. I'm like, fuck. Like,
yeah.
Oh no. And then what does he even say? Like, she says like, who are you? And he's like, I'm the big bad wolf or something. Like, you're just like, no, get out of there. And then
and so Jess is like freaking out at this point because she's like, oh my God, like he's gonna rape her or something. And I was like, I think he's gonna do something more sinister. I think he's gonna like, twist her into, falling for him and furthering to ruin Sam's life and drive that wedge in his family.
Yeah, like the whole thing, like I said before, the way he goes about ruining Sam's life, like he deliberately targets his mistress, he kills his dog, and then he's seducing his daughter. I'm like, oh, jeez, like,
yeah.
What else can this guy do? Like, he's just like, it's crazy.
It truly is crazy. And like, that's one of the highlight scenes of the film. Both Robert De Niro and Juliette Lewis were nominated for Oscars for this film for Best Supporting and Best Leading Performance. They both absolutely deserve it. Although what I'll say is that like the Best Supporting Actress nomination to Juliette Lewis for playing Danielle is almost creepy in a sense, but also very Hollywood to try to give an award or nominate somebody for an award for playing like a very innocent person who gets like caught up in this very gross relationship.
Yeah. Like, there's a great scene later on where, like, the dad, Sam, confronts her about Max, and she kind of giggles like a schoolgirl.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, by this point in the movie, Sam is so, like, twisted up. He kind of physically assaults his daughter. And it's so, like, it's heartbreaking. Like, the whole thing is just so...
Yeah, because Sam's becoming a monster as well. Like Katie is warping his entire personality. And, like, we find out as the film goes on, we find out really quickly, relatively, that Sam isn't necessarily a great person. And maybe Sam tries to outwardly look like a saint and a good person, but, you know, he is cheating on his wife. He has cheated on his wife. Danielle is quite anxious and upset about the relationship of her parents at home.
Mm-hmm.
He's not the angel that he is potentially shown as at the beginning of the film.
It's almost like he wants everyone to think he's Atticus Finch, but behind closed doors, he's like what Atticus Finch was probably like in real life.
Right.
He's not a monster either. He's just a little bit of a shithead.
Yeah.
There's that scene where, like, him and his wife start fighting, and Julie runs into a room and, like, turns on the TV so she doesn't have to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, you really feel for her in that moment. You're like, fuck, like,
right.
Everything is falling down around her.
Yeah.
There is also that great scene where they have that big fight where Leigh finds out about the affair that he's been having.
Yeah.
And they have this big fight where they, like, rehash a bunch of stuff. And she basically says, well, why didn't you just leave me if you didn't want to be with me? And he calls out, like, about how depressed she was at one point and how he was scared to leave her. And she's basically, it's almost like my favorite line in the whole movie where she's like, what, did you think I was going to kill myself over you?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah. It definitely paints a very interesting portrait of who Sam Bowden is.
And I do think Nick Nolte really brought home just how, like, as the movie goes on, like, he becomes increasingly more disheveled.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he starts smoking, and, like, during the final showdown, he looks just as, like, bloody and, like, torn up as Max Cady does. Like,
yeah.
There is almost kind of like a Cain and Abel type thing where they're almost like, you know, at certain points, Katie says kind of facetiously, like, oh, I guess I'm a lawyer now, too. We're just two lawyers kind of talking shop. And by the end of the movie, you're kind of like, these guys are they're both kind of monsters in their own way.
Yeah.
I mean, Katie is objectively the worst person, but, like,
yeah,
I don't know. That scene at the end when, like, they're fighting and, like, Sam picks up a rock, I'm like, oh, wow, like, we're really going for it. Like, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was some old school, like, Old Testament stuff right there.
Yeah, that's some real Cain and Abel shit. Like,
yeah.
And then, like, he just screams. There's this part where he, like, grabs a big rock and he's just like, I'm gonna kill you. And you're like, whoa, dude, you're a lawyer.
Part of what I like about this film, too, is how Max Cady uses the law against Sam as well, right? Like, Did you think that it was suspicious in the diner when Sam goes to basically threaten Max or warn Max that if he doesn't skip town that somebody's going to come and rough him up? Did it cross your mind that he might be wearing a wire at that point in time?
You know, it didn't, but when it did happen, I was like, okay.
I caught it. Yeah. I caught it because while Max and him are standing there having that discussion, Max said, would you mind saying that again? And I was like, he's wearing a wire right now. I was like, freaking genius. And, like, it was just such a little detail that, like, I picked up on and I really appreciated it. And then it came full circle. And then, like, you know, like, he literally uses the law against him to get a restraining order, like, to get Sam
against him.
Yeah.
And it's so, yeah, he killed his dog. He's seducing his daughter. He beat up his mistress, and now he's getting charges pressed against him. There's that great scene where Sam goes to call, like, the best criminal lawyer in town, and the criminal is like, oh, actually, Max Cady has already retained my services, so,
yeah,
you know. And then, like, he goes, that same lawyer represents Max Cady against Sam for an assault charge, and he's just like, Judge, you have the wisdom of Solomon. It's just so, it's very, like, oh my God, like, you do kind of feel for Sam during those moments. You're like, your life is over, dude. Like,
yeah. He's twisted this in such a way that like, how do you win this? But you know, like, and that's the thing is Max. The thing with Max and him being a psycho is that he is that Max would never stop. Max would never stop until his life was ruined, but Max would always take it one step too far and eventually go for the kill. And that's what we see later on in the film, right? And that's where we get the title of the film, Cape Fear, when they go to Cape Fear, which is at an actual location, I believe in North Carolina.
Is Cape Fear a real place?
It is a real place.
Why would anyone ever go to Cape Fear? That's like going to like Mount Death or like Lake Acid.
Yeah, like, and so what's actually funny is Cape Fear actually isn't a location, I don't believe, in the original novel. And it was the director of the 1962 version where he was basically trying to come up with a title because he didn't like the title of called The Executioners. He wanted to come up with a good title that would hook audiences, and his thought process was, if I find a really interesting sounding location, that movies like this tend to do very well. So that's
kind of clever, actually.
Yeah. So that's why he settled on the name of Cape Fear and why the last part of the film takes place there.
Interesting.
I gotta say, like, how iconic of an ending is that, like, this battle in this, like, crazy storm in a houseboat in the middle of nowhere. Like, there's nobody coming to help you. It's a pretty epic final act to the film.
I do have one complaint about the movie, and it comes into play in the final act. Can I get into it?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you're gonna like this, but I'm just gonna say it. I think during the last 20 minutes, I kind of stopped liking Robert De Niro's acting.
Interesting.
You know what I thought he was hamming it up a little too much at the end. You know what I mean? There's that final shot where like he gets handcuffed to a post and like he starts drowning, and as he's drowning, he's like
evil look. The shouting incoherently.
He's shouting like incoherently, and he starts like singing this song. I was a little like, okay, Robbie, like bring it down, buddy.
Yeah,
like,
so what he was actually shouting was he was speaking in tongues, and basically like what he was saying was he was talking about like his ascent into heaven at that point in time.
Okay, so he was speaking like another language or something?
Yeah, like in like some sort of like biblical kind of language about his ascension into heaven, because he's like, in his eyes, he's this godlike figure. You know, he became more than human. That's one of my favorite quotes in the whole movie is when he's talking about, he's like, you know, in prison, those 14 years, I was surrounded by people who were less than human. And while I was in there, I decided to become more than human.
Yeah.
And
it's, yeah.
And that's like, you know, there's some determination in there that's really interesting about the character of Max is you know, how much this idea of vengeance on somebody and deciding his vengeance rests with Sam.
It's hard kind of not to like Katie in the sense that like he basically built himself up from nothing out of pure spite.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, it turns out he's like, when we are told that 14 years ago he was this illiterate jackass, but like it turns out he's actually a frighteningly intelligent guy once he applies himself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And all it took was this pure like need for vengeance.
Pure vengeance. So let that be a lesson to any of the young people watching this. If you ever want to better yourself, just use vengeance as fuel.
All you need is a mortal enemy, and Michael or I could be that person for you.
Yeah, I would be happy to be your mortal enemy.
Subscribe to our Patreon, which doesn't exist, and
yeah, exactly. I won't consider myself successful until I have a mortal enemy, but
the premium tier is just you become a mortal enemy of one of us.
Basically. So no, but there's that scene where like those three thugs try to rough him up, and he kicks the shit out of all three of them, and he basically says like, what does he say? Like he starts basically like, I don't remember specifically what he says, but he starts like raving about how like he's become almost like a god, and like you know, it takes more than pain to like, you know, what does he say? He has that line where he's like, takes more than like a sock to the guts to keep me down. Like,
right. Yeah. Oh man, that was such a great scene too, because like you weren't sure if he was going to end up finding Sam or what he was going to do to Sam in that moment. And he just he just walks away and he's like, it's not worth it. I'll get you later.
It's just like,
thing.
Yeah, fuck it. And what he basically says is like, it doesn't really matter anyway.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You know, it doesn't change my plans.
No, yeah. It was, that was a highlight scene for me in the film.
By the way, remember how in our last episode I mentioned there was one moment, a very innocuous moment early on, where I was like, oh, come on, no, that's terrible. And I knew it would come back later.
Right.
It's early, I think after his sort of mistress has just been assaulted. Mm-hmm. Sam is playing the piano and he's like, oh, like the chord is missing. As soon as he said the piano chord is missing, I'm like, no.
Oh, I never noticed that.
I was like, no. And then later on, he uses the piano chord to kill the world's worst private detective.
Right. That's, oh my God. I didn't even catch on to that until just now, but you're right. And so my thing was like with the, him wearing the wire basically. And
okay. That was your moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was my
moment. We both had different moments where we're like, oh shit.
Did you know before Katie turned around that he was, dressed as their housekeeper?
I had a suspicion where I was like,
yeah.
That's another moment where I was like, that's a little ridiculous, but okay. Like, I get it. Yeah. It's almost like Heath Ledger's Joker dressed as the nurse in The Dark Knight, where you're just like, like, all right. Like, he can sort of pull it off.
You know what? Also, I bet you that is a callback to this movie. I would almost like guarantee it.
As soon as they said, like, the private detective was like, oh, well, Gabriella, they have this, like, Mexican nanny. They're like, oh, well, Gabriella has to stay the night. As soon as they said that, I'm like, yep, like, she's gonna die.
Unfortunately.
And I mentioned earlier a moment I, like, laughed out loud, like, kind of bitterly.
Yep.
It's when they find the dead private investigator.
Oh, and he falls in the blood?
He slips in the blood, and then he runs out, and he just starts shooting blindly into the dark.
Yep. That was a great scene. Yeah.
Crazy.
We were talking about Robert De Niro's performance. I do want to say quickly, like, the accent that he puts on is, like, I guess he did it for an earlier movie, that Southern accent, but
oh, really?
It's kind of incredible. Like, I would have never...
It's a good accent.
Yeah.
It's believable.
It's so believable. And the way he was able to do that is, like I said, he had already played a Southerner for a prior film. But what he did was he took the script of this and he went down into the Southern states and asked like locals to read lines from the movie for him. And he'd record those and then like practice saying it like they did.
Wow, I can imagine you're like a corn farmer in like the deep south, and Robert De Niro shows up. He's like, "Can you just read this out loud for me?" And then he records. He's like, "Okay, thanks." So then a couple years later, he's in this movie. You're like, "What?"
I mean, you gotta love his style of acting, or his what's the word I'm looking for?
Like method acting?
Well, he's not I wouldn't say that's necessarily method acting, but his
commitment.
Yeah, his commitment to acting.
I think speaking of commitment, I think I read that he spent like $20,000 to get his teeth a little fucked up for the role.
So he spent $5,000 getting his teeth messed up, and then he spent $20,000 having to get them fixed again afterwards.
Jesus.
He went to a dentist and like he was like, $5,000, I want you to mess my teeth up for this role. And on that note as well, like the tattoos were actually real tattoos with vegetable dye, though like he would have actually gone through the whole tattoo process, and then over time, because it's just vegetable dye, it actually faded and those tattoos went away. But like, think of the commitment to sit in a tattoo chair for that long and get all of those tattoos, because he had a lot.
I didn't realize you could do temporary tattoos like that.
I can't imagine that too many people would go through that process, that painstaking process of getting that done, but you know, it's Robert De Niro, so
I guess so. I will say, like, you know, I've never really been an acting guy in the sense where like I'm more interested in like the story and like the directing and stuff than I am in the performances. But like watching this movie, I was kind of like, you know, De Niro's he's definitely one of the greats. You know?
Oh, absolutely. He's one of my favorite actors of all time, and he's objectively one of the greatest actors of all time. I once looked up his net worth compared to to Al Pacino's, and it eclipses Al Pacino like 10-1 almost. Like it was pretty wild. De Niro is a very wealthy man.
I wouldn't doubt it. It's pretty funny.
So there's two unbelievable moments in this film for me that were like almost like there was the one was actually worse than the other. Early in the film when he pays for the ice cream, I was like, how did he know they were going to that ice cream store? That one took me out for a second. But the other one that was like, it was almost funny how ridiculous it was, is Max having strapped himself and holding on to the bottom of the car for what would have been probably hours.
And it's funny because that's one of the most iconic scenes in the whole movie.
Right.
But yeah,
it's just so ridiculous. But at that point, like, I didn't care. I just laughed because it was so ridiculous. But I did like this small touch of like his shirt being burned from the road, and having the holes, and then his elbows being kind of bloody from hitting the road and stuff. But there's no way he wouldn't be dead after that kind of a trip.
There's a great scene where like he crawls out from under the car and like he had his belt around suspension or something, and he crawls out and he makes like eye contact with like the elderly neighbor, and he just very calmly throws the belt in the garbage and walks into the bathroom to clean himself up.
Yeah, I had a good laugh at that moment, for sure.
But at the same time, you kind of believe that if anyone could pull that off, it would be this character.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, because he's more than human.
He's more than human. Jesus. And then that leads to like one of the funniest Simpsons parodies where like, you know, Homer's like, "Hey kids, do you want to drive through the cabbage field?" Sideshow Bob's like, "No."
What a great episode.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I remember that episode from like 20 years ago. So moving into effects and filming, Martin Scorsese, you know, this is his month. I wanted to talk about his directing style. This film is kind of almost, even though it's incredibly well directed, it's incredibly well shot, it doesn't necessarily feel like a typical Martin Scorsese film. And I think part of that is there's much less voiceover narration from the main characters' perspectives that you kind of get used to watching movies like Goodfellas, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Casino. The other thing is like a lot of those films use montages very well, and this film kind of has neither of those. And it's really impressive that, because a lot of directors often rely on kind of their traditional filming styles and directors their vision to kind of make similar movies in sense of tone and the way that they're shot. And this one just, it feels like a Martin Scorsese film while also feeling like a Hitchcockian film, like a unique film to his filmography.
I will say this movie was it had a lot of interesting flourishes. Like, there's lots of like Dutch angles. There's lots of moments where like the colors almost invert and you're like, wait, what? And then,
yeah. And that scene where he wakes up and he thinks that he sees Max in their bedroom.
Yeah.
And it's like the movie almost takes on like a paranormal aspect in that point in time. And that's just partially because of like how deep Max is into Sam's head.
It definitely, this is going to sound weird, but it almost felt very like MTV in certain ways. Like just the way it was shot and stuff. I was like, okay, I wouldn't have expected this from a Scorsese movie, but I'm also not a Scorsese guy, so what do I know? But I mean, it worked. It worked for the subject matter.
Right. Yeah. So the way that this film came to be, like the remake of this, was actually Steven Spielberg was developing the remake of this, and then he decided that this was maybe too violent of a film for him, and he actually traded it to Martin Scorsese. So he gave Martin Scorsese this film in exchange for Schindler's List.
Huh.
Yeah, one of like Steven Spielberg's like most important films ever. So it ended up working out quite well in Steven Spielberg's favor, but
yeah, I'll say also Liam Neeson's favor.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'll say though is so the reason why they ended up trading this is because Steven Spielberg basically said to Martin Scorsese, I really think that Cape Fear is going to be a widespread hit. Like, I think that this film has widespread appeal, and a film like this could really boost your career as a director. And so if you want this, like I'll trade you this to kind of help you in your career. Because the film that he had done before this was Last Temptation of the Christ. And that was a really controversial film at the time, and probably still continues to be a bit of a controversial film based on the subject matter.
That's with Willem Dafoe as Jesus, right?
Correct, yes.
But that's also what's so cool about Martin Scorsese is that he does these gritty gangster films, and then every now and then he just throws a fastball at you, and you're like, what? Mm-hmm. Okay, like. Mm-hmm. So also, I guess Steven Spielberg is a really nice guy. He'll just throw projects at you.
Yeah.
But can you imagine though? There's a parallel universe where like Martin Scorsese directed Schindler's List and Robert De Niro is Oscar Schindler.
I mean, I think we're living in the right timeline in that sense. So
yeah, I guess so. I would like to visit the other timeline just to see it though.
Although what I was thinking earlier at one point, and I didn't say this, was this movie, the paranoia that this movie pulls out of you is very similar to Jaws, especially in like the scene where they're on the beach and you think that somebody's going to be eaten, and Sheriff Brody thinks that somebody's going to be eaten, and you and him are kind of looking around to see if the shark's going to appear or not. This film was kind of that scene, but for 2 hours, basically. Like, I was like, where is Max going to pop out next? What is he going to do to derail the next part of Sam's life?
No kidding. There's so many moments where you're like, oh, come on.
Yeah. And so Martin Scorsese actually had the script with him while he was making Goodfellas. He read it 3 times in full and was like, this is garbage. I don't want to do this.
Really?
Yeah. And eventually he came around to it because he started thinking about it in like the terms of like Alfred Hitchcock. Like he really wanted to make like a Hitchcockian kind of film in the cinematography and the camera angles that are used. And I think those kind of camera angles are somewhat missing from our movies today. Like you don't see a lot of these old style camera angles anymore. Like it's a lot of like the wide shots, the shots that are supposed to invoke awe from you from like big CGI scenes and stuff like that. And I kind of really miss these smaller techniques.
There's that one scene early on where Sam and his wife are in the bathroom talking, and it just keeps cutting back and forth with the two of them, and it's like his head is like really in the foreground and like her reflection is behind him, and then they cut forward to like a reverse shot, and I remember just thinking like, this is a really interesting way to shoot this scene. And like,
right,
speaking of which, like all the scenes with mirrors, like there's so many mirrors in this movie, and it just creates this sense of like duplicity or like, you know, duality almost, where you're like, whoa. Like there's that scene early on where the wife sits in front of like her vanity or something, and there's like 4 different like reflections of her looking back. It's
right,
very striking. And like, yeah, like you don't really see that anymore. I mean, you see that from like more like interesting like artsy movies, but like you don't really see that from like, you know, your typical Hollywood whatever.
Yeah, your big budget films anymore. Which are all action movies now.
Pretty much, yeah. So as much as we liked John Wick 4, there weren't too many. Anyways, I'm gonna let that joke wither on the vine. But
we don't usually talk about like other casting choices here, but there is some very cool potential casting that almost happened. Harrison Ford, Scorsese originally had him in mind for the role of Sam. But Harrison Ford read the script and was like, I'll only do this film if I get to play Max.
Ooh.
And that was a deal breaker for Martin Scorsese. So Nick Nolte actually really wanted to play the role of Sam Bowden. Like he thought he could bring it to that role.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which, you know, it's not the glory role necessarily in this film.
That almost makes me respect Nick Nolte more. The fact that he's like, oh, I can be like the less interesting version.
Yeah, no, he was,
I can do justice to it.
Yeah, he was really adamant to take that role on and convince Scorsese to give him that role.
There was probably a early meeting where Scorsese was like, are you sure you want to play Sam? And Nick Nolte was like, I have spoken.
The role of Max Cady actually almost originally went to Bill Murray in the Steven Spielberg adaptation.
Shut the front door. That is so funny.
Think of how different of a movie that is, though, right? Like, it definitely becomes like it's 2 very charismatic actors bringing 2 very different types of
performances to the character of Max Cady.
I love Bill Murray, but that would have been such a mistake.
It would have been more like Jack Nicholson's Joker than...
Yeah. That's a good comparison.
Yeah, because we've been comparing it to him to modern day Jokers, but he would have been more like Jack Nicholson, which, I mean, in its own right could have been very entertaining, but...
I guess so. I'm glad we don't live in that universe, but
yeah.
Speaking of Bill Murray, we need to do Groundhog Day at some point, because that's one of my favorite movies.
Yes, you know what? Maybe next year's the year to do it. We've talked about it a few times. Actually, funny enough, when Jason and I were originally talking about the ideas that we wanted to maybe do with this podcast, one idea that we had was every year for the first February episode, we just do Groundhog's Day, and we talk about it like the same, basically do the same.
Every year it's just like we're talking about it for the first time. Yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah,
I think we should do that.
Yeah, maybe next year will be the first year we try that. But
okay, our first Groundhog Day episode.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. That's actually, I'm gonna fist bump Jason when I see him next time. That's pretty funny.
I think I was equally involved in that idea, but...
Okay, I'll fist bump you too. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to make you feel so excluded.
Let's talk score really quickly.
Dun, dun, dun,
it's so bombastic. Dun. Like it's such a great orchestral score for like eliciting the feeling of making you unsettled throughout the film. It just keeps coming back, right? And it feels like it gets louder and louder as the film goes on.
It almost kind of reminded me of like the Psycho theme, which I can't actually do off the top of my head, but I was getting Psycho vibes from it.
Yeah, and again, that's where like the influences of Hitchcock are very apparent there. And I believe Scorsese used a collaborator with Hitchcock to kind of help make the film. They actually took like the original score of the original film, which again, at that point in time was very heavily influenced on Hitchcockian films, and they reworked the score for this film, but they tried to almost like ham up the Hitchcockian element to it even more.
Yeah, really. It's like, how intense do you want this score to be? It's like, yes.
Yeah, it's pure paranoia.
Very intense.
Yeah.
No. You know what? It kind of reminds me of The Shining. The Shining score. Yeah. That like big wide shot where they're driving through the mountains. I'm like,
yeah. I very much agree. It's great. Like this is a top tier score for me. And we've already done some very good scores, but this one, like no other film that we've done, like there's been some really great catchy scores that get into my head, but this one got into my head in a different way.
I feel like this is one of the few scores that will actually like linger with me afterwards.
Yeah.
It's rare for that to happen with a score, but I feel like this will be one of them.
So sequels, prequels, or reboots, we've already talked about this in quite a bit of detail. There's the Simpson episode that we've kind of talked about a little bit and how great of an episode it is. And I do think I'll probably go back in the next week or two and rewatch that episode, because
I might watch it tonight after we get off this recording session.
What's really interesting actually is I went really deep on this. And so if like, let's think about this in terms of the trajectory of The Executioner. So The Executioner starts as a novel in 1957, is adapted once in 1962, and then is readapted in 1991. Each time we see those comparisons that are laid out really well on the Wikipedia page under The Executioners. And then The Simpsons, several years later, parodies it, and it becomes a very classic Simpsons episode. So now subsequent to that, actually, in the 2010s, somebody made a play called Mr. Burns, a post-electric play. So it has really good reviews. I found a version of it on YouTube that I'm actually going to check out. And basically, the whole premise of the play is about how stories change and are changed by humans over time. And so basically, it's a 3-part play about the immediate aftermath of an apocalyptic event and the survivors kind of recounting the Simpsons episode of Cape Fear. And then it takes place like 30 years in the future. And then it's like, this traveling group of
performers in this post-apocalyptic wasteland, and how the story of Cape Fear has changed from there. And then at the final act of the film is again them recounting this play in 70 years later, and how the story has changed and become more and more grand in its scope, and how it's mixed different stories in with this story. And I thought that was really cool because in a sense, like it's almost meta in the sense that like how the story of Cape Fear has evolved and changed over time, and been remade and parodied and reparodied. And it's just really, really interesting, I think, and I really want to check that play out. So I have it saved in my watch list now to go watch it afterwards.
Who would even? I'm just reading the description of this on Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Who would even think to do this? That's actually really cool.
It's such a genius idea, and like I said, it kind of plays on like the folklore of like humans telling stories for thousands of years, and how those stories change and adapt, and you know how we're telling the same stories, only we're changing them as time goes on. It's such a fascinating idea, and I'm really excited to check the play out. So yeah, just YouTube Mr. Burns, a post-electric play, and you can watch it online right now.
I changed my mind. I may actually watch this after we're done recording.
Nice.
Instead of Cape Fear, or the Cape Fear this Simpsons episode.
Yeah.
Actually, the Simpsons episode aired in 1993, only 2 years after Cape Fear.
Right. Yeah. So it was definitely like a still very much in the culture at that point in time, right? And everyone would have gotten the jokes and would have really enjoyed a parody like that at that point in time.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. So Legacy, we've kind of hammered home a lot of this stuff, honestly. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. I already said that Juliette Lewis and Robert De Niro both nominated for an Oscar. They did. Neither of them won the Oscar. So I like to point out who beat them in this year. It was Anthony Hopkins won for Silence of the Lambs over.
Okay, fair.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah, exactly. One of the most iconic performances of all time.
Robert De Niro probably saw that movie and he was like, "Shit, like, I'm not gonna."
All these vegetable tattoos and teeth reconstruction for nothing.
That's pretty good.
But the fact that he was even nominated is pretty impressive, right? Because like a role like that doesn't necessarily get recognized by the Academy very often.
No, definitely not.
And then Mercedes Ruehl actually won in The Fisher King for Best Supporting Actress. And
you know what? I haven't seen The Fisher King in like 10 years, but that makes sense. She did a really good job.
I haven't seen that at all. Jason and I have talked about doing that for the podcast at some point in time, because I mean, we haven't even done a Robin Williams movie yet, so.
Oh man, we're missing out.
Yeah.
You know, it's next year. It's going to be 10 years since we lost him.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's sad.
Yeah, agreed. So, personal reviews on The Partner Factor. I am dying to hear what your thoughts on this movie are.
I think you kind of already know. So I didn't watch it with a partner. I watched it by myself, and I really liked it. I liked it a lot. Sometimes you tell me you're like, go watch this. And I'm like, all right. And then I go watch it and I'm like, Or I'm like, I either like it or I don't like it. But this has been two absolute bangers after another where I'm just like, I really liked this movie a lot, actually.
Yeah, so did I. So did I. And it's funny because I wouldn't say this is in Martin Scorsese's top 5 films score-wise on IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes, but it's definitely a very unique one in his filmography, and it's one that I really, really enjoyed, and I guarantee I will come back to at some point in time.
I totally agree. And maybe it's just because we're talking about Martin Scorsese, the director, but this is the first Scorsese movie I've seen where I'm like, oh, like, okay, Martin Scorsese. Like, I respect the guy a lot. You know what I mean? It gave me a greater, at least, awareness of what he's doing and what a guy like De Niro is doing.
Right. Yeah. And how they're working off of each other and feeding off each other. Yeah, I would echo very same review as you. Like, Robert De Niro's performance is an absolute standout for me. On the flip side of that, like, Jess actually really hated this movie because
really,
yes, and like the reason for that is again what I said earlier in the first episode when I was saying that this is a very aggressive film, and a very violent film, and that calls back to the 70s and 80s and almost like the exploitation kind of films. And that's a genre that appeals to sometimes a very niche group of people, and I'm kind of one of those niche group of people. And part of that's also because, you know, like growing up as a 90s kid, like Quentin Tarantino being so important to my understanding of movies and cinema, and his kind of his inspirations draw from these types of movies very often.
Well, and I think it's also just, we've talked about how some people watch movies to escape and to feel good.
Yes.
And some people want to feel miserable, and I'm one of those people.
And I am too sometimes. Like, like when I showed you Green Room this weekend, and I was...
That was you're really wheeling out all the miserable movies right now.
Yeah,
which I respect. But I enjoy the catharsis and like the tension that a movie like this creates. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy it to almost, frankly, a sickening degree.
And like I said kind of earlier, because I have this relationship with this movie, that I've seen The Simpsons, and the Sideshow Bob episode is so iconic to me that like it creates this nostalgia for the 90s, even though I'd never seen this movie before. That I was like, I was already like very quickly invested in this film and had good feelings. Like I was almost biased going into this film based on like my past experiences.
You kind of went in already sold. You're like, this is gonna be great.
Yeah.
But it paid off though.
Yeah.
Like the movie lived up to your expectations, which doesn't always happen.
And like I'll say this, like again, like I'm coming from, this is one of the very few times where I haven't seen the original before I'm seeing the and this isn't even the original, right? But like the original from the 90s, its own take on the story. But I've seen like parodies of this, and so a lot of our viewers are going to come from the same experience of seeing the parodies or seeing like snippets of this film being used and abused in other films. And for me, and for me, I really, really, I almost appreciated it more seeing it in its original form, from the mastermind of Martin Scorsese.
Straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
I don't know if I said this before in a previous episode, but it's funny how many movies The Simpsons has ruined for us.
Yeah.
Just growing up with that audience, like, and I respect it wholeheartedly, but like, you know, like they spoiled Citizen Kane and the one Mr. Burns episode. Mm-hmm. Like it just, the list goes on.
But like I said, I think I appreciated this more, even going in, like I was already somewhat biased and invested in the movie because I already knew the connections to prior works that I've seen.
By the way, speaking of which, I realized this after the fact. There's an old South Park episode that parodied Mad Max Fury Road that I realized later. I'm like, oh, okay, like South Park was making fun of this.
Oh,
like,
that's hilarious.
South Park was making fun of this before I even knew what this was.
Nice. That's awesome.
Thanks, South Park. Thanks, Simpsons. What would we do without you guys?
Probably cry.
Cry a lot more, you mean?
Yeah. Although maybe it's too real now, what they predicted for what was going to happen in the world.
And on that dour note.
Yeah. I think that's going to be it for us. So, like I said, this is Martin Scorsese month, so we do have one more Scorsese film to do. We haven't settled on it yet. There's a few different options we've kind of bounced around. I think you and Jason kind of need to finalize it. Some of the ideas that we're bouncing around right now are like Raging Bull, King of Comedy, Casino, Last Temptation of the Christ, which we mentioned, After Hours, a straight comedy from Martin Scorsese.
I'll just say this now. Mm-hmm. It would be really interesting to see like a unconventional Scorsese movie, like a gangster movie or something, or not a gangster movie. I mean, like one of his more like kind of out there projects.
Yeah,
just to showcase like the kind of range that the guy has. Like even if we can't do Hugo because it's post 2000. But
yeah,
you know what I mean.
Like and a lot of viewers have seen a lot of his more modern movies, especially because like Martin Scorsese is kind of a guy who's like his films have become more revered over time. Like each it feels like each movie that comes out gets better reviews and better and gets better in terms of director style and who he's working with over time.
He's one of the rare creatives who actually gets better as he gets as he approaches, you know, his twilight years instead of worse.
Yeah, exactly. Like obviously Goodfellas is objectively one of his best, and in my opinion it is his best, but like we've talked about, like The Departed and Wolf of Wall Street, The Irishman, like these are all incredible movies that people really, really love to this day.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, on that note, like if you have a favorite from Martin Scorsese's earlier part of his career, let us know in the comments if there's one in particular that you want us to check out.
Yeah, sound off down below.
All right.
And like and subscribe while you're at it, you know.
Smash
you may
that
as
like
well.
button.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that is going to be it for us. Until next time.
Until next time, you know, keep an eye out for any stray piano wires and try not to slip in any blood.
Watch out for potential foreshadowing moments in your life.
Yeah, actually, if that's the one advice I could give to any young person, watch out for foreshadowing.